Hello, in this video I want to share top 5 great ironies of history with you. Let us start with the story of the brazen bull, or of a bronze bull. The story is brought to us by Diodorus of Sicily, and this story is a dark reminder of a time when rulers used to torture their political opposition in front of great crowds of people and take pride in it. So the story starts with the tyrant of the ancient city-state of Crusades that is located in southern Sicily. The king Phalaris used to force his opponents to enter the brazen bull. Then he would close the bull, set fire below it, and essentially burn his opponents alive, while the complex network of tubes inside of the bull would turn their screams into the bellowing of a bull. And that made the torture even worse from a psychological perspective, and it turned the entire process into a theater for a crowd that was gathered to watch the process. And this device became synonymous with a symbol of grotesque and dark torture from the ancient times. And even the Romans themselves were fascinated by this story, which is why they later used the device themselves. This is the Diodorus of Sicily that actually claimed to have seen the bull himself. And this is how the city of Crusades looks today. But the irony of the story begins with its inventor, with the inventor of the brazen bull, Perillus. According to Diodorus, when Perillus invented the bull, the evil king Phalaris asked him to enter the bull in order to see whether a human can really fit inside. And when he entered the bull, the king closed the device, set fire below it, and listened to the screams of its inventor. And just before he died, he was taken from the bull and thrown from a cliff. But the irony doesn't end here, because there was an uprising against the evil king by the young rebel named Telemachus in the 6th century before Christ, and the king himself was now forced to enter the device, and he died screaming, while his screams echoed like the bellows of a bull. And the king was also famous for making the necklaces of the burned bones of his opponents. And the Roman historians later claimed that they captured the device in their fight with their arch enemies, the Carthaginians. Scipio Africanus the Younger allegedly captured the device from Carthage, and the Carthaginians themselves colonized the city of Crusades, and that is how they got their hands on this horrible device. And the Romans later used this device in order to torture escaped slaves and Christians. And in the medieval times, the Merovingians stopped using this device, probably because it was used to torture the Christians, and now the Merovingians were Christians, so they decided to use other horrible forms of torture, such as impaling people on spikes and stuff like that. But okay, let us now continue with our list of great ironies of history. It wouldn't be a list of ironies if we didn't mention the Soviet Union. One could argue that the entire existence of the Soviet state was actually one great joke of history. And why is that? Well, because the system that was supposed to create a secular utopia on Earth, and here we can see how the Soviet artists depicted this great search for a utopia on Earth. Well, this process ended in the darkness of Stalinism, but there is another layer of irony. The very same state that was the second largest economy in the world and had the second largest military in the world, the first civilization that sent a man and a satellite to space, the very same state suffered from shortages of razor blades, nails, soap, simply because that was the nature of the planned economy. Planned economies are simply worse at creating commodity goods than the free markets that create an abundance of commodity goods. But the irony of the Soviet Union that I want to focus on today is what happened during the process of the Great Purges. Now, after Stalin, the man most responsible for the Great Purges was actually Yezhov, the boss of NKVD, the Soviet Secret Services. And Yezhov, in his crazy pursuit of killing as much traitors as he could, actually destabilized the Soviet Union, killing 75% of the Central Committee. And when Stalin learned of that information, he began to suspect Yezhov himself, and he accused him of being a Japanese spy. And under torture, Yezhov admitted to being a Japanese spy. And on this picture, you can see what happened to him. He got killed by the very same system that he enforced and used to torture others. And the very same thing happened to Lavrenti Beria. After the death of Stalin, Khrushchev and Beria began a great power struggle for the throne of the Soviet Union. Khrushchev was supported by Zhukov and the army, while Beria was supported by the secret services. But it turns out that when you have the support of the army, you have the state. And Khrushchev, together with Zhukov and his army, managed to capture Beria, and under torture, Beria admitted of being a British spy, and he was killed. And the irony is that Beria was the last man ever to be killed in a show trial in the Soviet Union, a fitting end for a man that killed so many of his fellow communists in show trials. But in the same way in which I simply had to mention communism, I have to mention the Crusades. And like with communism, there are multiple layers of irony about the Crusades. The first and the most obvious is the fact that the ideology that was supposed to be peaceful, and back in the Roman days, Emperor Diocletian even persecuted the Christians because of how peaceful they were. Some of them refused to serve in wars, and that's why they got killed. But this very same ideology launched the Crusades, not to mention that Jesus quite explicitly said, "My kingdom is not of this earth," and then the Crusaders went on to capture the Holy Land. But I want to focus on a third layer of irony that is not so often discussed about the Crusades, and that is the fact that the only other crusade, other than the first crusade that captured Jerusalem, the only other successful crusade was the Sixth Crusade. And what is so ironical about the Sixth Crusade succeeding? Well, the fact that it was done by Frederick II of Sicily. Now, Frederick II was engaged in a battle with the Pope for the supremacy in Europe. He saw himself as the Holy Roman Emperor, as the most powerful man in Europe, while Pope disagreed and wanted to conquer his vassal states in Italy. Pope actually went on a war of conquest against Frederick's vassal states in Italy, while Frederick was engaged in a crusade. And the reason for that is that after the Pope excommunicated Frederick from the church in an attempt to weaken his position with the feudal lords, Frederick decided, out of spite, to actually conquer Jerusalem and proclaimed himself emperor in Jerusalem. And he decided to do it just at the right time, as the Sultan of Egypt, Al-Kamil, was engaged in a power struggle with his brother that was stealing his feudal estates in northern Iraq, and his evil brother actually became allied with the Khwarazmian Empire, and now his brother was stealing his feudal estates, which is why Al-Kamil decided to make a deal with the Crusaders. And Frederick II of Sicily, under this agreement, would get the Holy Land, and he would get to proclaim himself the king the king of the Holy Roman Empire, inside of Jerusalem just after he was excommunicated by the Pope. And here you can see the statue of a Pope in Vatican. He would get to proclaim himself emperor in Jerusalem, which was a big deal and which was the Pope's worst nightmare. So in exchange for fighting Al-Kamil's brother, Frederick would get the throne of Jerusalem, but the condition was that he needed to allow Muslims to go on their holy pilgrimages to Jerusalem, even after conquering the city. And Frederick was perfectly okay with it, because he was actually fascinated by Arab culture, and he liked Arabic language. He even knew how to speak Arabic, and he himself had a harem in his attempt to imitate the sultans of the East. And that also helped him form an alliance with Al-Kamil. His knowledge of Arabic and of Arabic culture, and after all, Sicily was full of Arabs at that time, and Frederick was a king of Sicily, among other things, among being now a king of Jerusalem and a king of the Holy Roman Empire. And by the way, the fact that he married Isabel II also gave him a blood right to the throne of Jerusalem, although many Muslims still didn't recognize that blood right. But what mattered is that Al-Kamil did, the Sultan of Egypt did. And the irony is that actually through diplomacy, Frederick managed to get Jerusalem, and not only did he do it despite what the Pope wanted, but he did it in an alliance with a Muslim sultan that used the Crusaders in order to fight his brother. This entire story really illustrates that these perceptions of all Muslims being one entity and all Christians being another entity is bullshit. The history is far more complex than just these two sides fighting each other. From Al-Kamil's perspective, his brother was a bigger problem than the Crusades. But okay, now let us move on, and I really want to share with you this bizarre story about Vikings. I'm talking about the story of Sigurd the Mighty. And this entire story is brought to us by the Orkneyinga saga, so we also actually don't know if the story is true or not, but Sigurd the Mighty, according to this Viking saga, was engaged in a dispute with another Viking called Malbriti, and they decided to settle their differences like men, according to this Orkneyinga saga. Each of them would bring 40 of his greatest warriors, and they would have a duel, 40 against 40. And we actually don't know what caused this battle, what was the reason for the beef that happened between these two men. Was it a Viking princess, or was it simply a struggle for land? We'll never know, but what we do know is that Sigurd the Mighty, the conqueror of the Swedish territories, actually decided to bring 80 men instead of 40, and he slaughtered his opponent. He decapitated him and put his head around his waist. But as he was riding away from the battle victoriously, the head of his opponent cut him on the leg, and his leg became infected and he died from infection. And this, if it truly did happen, is a example of one of the greatest karmic events in history. He cheated, and then later the fact that he took his opponent's head as a sign of triumph actually killed him, and he died from infection wounds. But okay, now let us end with a relevant topic, with Israel, with the history of Israel. Well, people often claim that Marxist utopia was never achieved on this earth, but I happen to agree with Jean-Paul Sartre, that claims that actually once, for once, it was achieved, and that is in Israel. And I'm not claiming that the kibbutz, the collective farms formed by the Jews, I'm not claiming that their entire society was perfectly just or peaceful, but I agree with Jean-Paul Sartre that if we define a Marxist utopia as a classless society, then the kibbutzim, the people that lived on the kibbutz, actually managed to form the classless society, especially in the early stage of the kibbutzim movement, which was between 1920s and 1950s. And in that period, they even didn't have money, which is exactly what Marx wanted. And you might ask, well, how the hell did they then distribute goods among them? Well, the only thing preventing one man from eating all the food or smoking all tobacco were actually social norms on the kibbutz. You would be hated if you do it by the others. Maybe your family would leave you. And the social norms until 1950s were the only thing preventing an individual from essentially taking all the resources for himself. And the reason why this utopia worked so well with the Jewish community at that time is that most of them were persecuted by the right-wingers all across Europe, especially in Russia, which is why many of them naturally gravitated towards leftist ideas. And a big difference between Soviet communism and this is that this entire movement was voluntary. People would voluntarily join the kibbutz and could leave at any point. If, for example, at one point they decided they had enough of this collective life, they could just leave and seek their fortune elsewhere. But the irony of the kibbutz movement is that the collective farms, the kibbutz movement in Israel, was at the same time seen as a symbol of proletariat brotherhood among the nations. And many Jews, especially those in the kibbutz movement, since they were Marxist and against racism and ultra-nationalism, they hoped to make peace with Palestinians. But on the other hand, since the kibbutz farms were formed on the border with Palestine, they at the same time became a symbol of Jewish nationalism and colonization, especially from the perspective of the Palestinians. And that is the great irony of the kibbutz movement. At the same time, they are a Marxist utopia, and they are a form of colonization that was formed on the land that was that used to belong to the Palestinians, but after they were ethnically cleansed, the kibbutz farms were formed on their land. So they are at the same time a leftist utopia and a right-wing tool of colonization of Palestinian land. That's the great irony of the kibbutz movement. And another layer of irony is that the ultra-religious Jews, by following their holy scripture, also came to the conclusion that collective property is the way to go, because God, according to them, wants people to be equal. And the ultra-religious Jews also formed the collective farms, as did the ultra-leftist secular Jews that were Marxist. But okay, that was the list of 5 great ironies of history, and if you like this video, don't forget to like, share and subscribe, and see you in the next video.